I wanted to end this part of the course with a brief summary of what we've done in the clustering lectures. So one of the main things or themes that I've tried to bring out in these videos is that the mixture of Gaussians approach, which is then fit using the EM algorithm, is very much like a soft k-means clustering approach, with the difference that this can handle non-axis aligned clusters, which have potentially non-equal weight. So lots of data could come from one cluster and relatively little data could come from another cluster. And it gives soft assignments back. To add a little bit more color on the correspondence, if it wasn't already obvious to you, in the k-means algorithm, we had our energy function, our cost function, C, that we defined at the very start of this series of videos. That corresponds in the EM mixture of Gaussians model very closely to the free energy. Whereas the free energy is a function of distributions over latent variables, the cost function is, in k-means, a function of hard assignments. In the mixture of Gaussians model, we have a whole bunch of parameters which include the means of Gaussians, the covariance matrices, and the mixing proportions. In the k-means algorithm, we just have the cluster centers, but the cluster centers have a very close correspondence with the means of the Gaussians. In the k-means algorithm, we have an assignment step which updates the assignment of data points to clusters. In the EM algorithm, we have an expectation step which does a soft assignment of data points to clusters. And in the k-means algorithm, when we update our cluster centers, we call that the update step for obvious reasons. In the EM approach, this is the maximization step where we update our parameters, but they're direct analogs of one another. And in fact, you could view the k-means algorithm as a special case of the mixture of Gaussians model, where the Q function is restricted to make hard assignments. So if you restrict the Q function so it doesn't equal the posterior each point, it equals a hard assignment of data points to clusters, then you recover the k-means algorithm. If you restrict the covariance of the data points to the covariance of the clusters to all be the same and say equal to the identity matrix, and you restrict the pi's to all have equal a priori probability. So you can sort of more formally show this relationship. Okay, so that was one of the themes, sort of building on and improving soft k-means clustering. Another theme is, of course, the EM algorithm itself. This can be used to fit many different latent variable models, not just the mixture of Gaussians clustering model. So actually principal component analysis can be fit this way, models called factor analysis, which generalize principal component analysis, mixture of Gaussians, HMMs, which we're going to see in the next sort of set of lectures on sequence models. They can also be fit in this way. All it requires is a tractable posterior. It requires that we can treat the true posterior in an exact way, and critically that we can compute the average log joint. Those are the two things that show up in the free energy, and if we can handle those, then we're sort of done and dusted. We can compute the EM algorithm. As I said, there are generalizations of this approach, which can handle nonlinear, non-Gaussian models, which are useful and result in things like variational autoencoders. And there are also incremental versions of this algorithm, which use things like stochastic updates as well. And it all comes from this sort of unifying perspective in terms of the free energy or the lower bound on the log likelihood. So that's why we presented things in this general way. Some limitations of the probabilistic approach, like, as I said, we sort of saw on the last chunk that maximum likelihood can definitely overfit. So you have to use these things with care. There are Bayesian approaches which form distributions over parameters and the cluster assignments, which can mitigate this. And there are, other workarounds at all, like we talked about in the last video. One important limitation of the mixture of Gaussians model is that it really assumes the clusters have simple shapes. Essentially, they are elliptical, coming from the contours of the Gaussians, which describe each cluster. And that means in practice that a single real cluster might be described by many components in your mixture of Gaussians model. Imagine you have two clusters which look like this in your in your data. So these are obviously non-elliptical, they have non-elliptical contours. If you fit your mixture Gaussians model, what you might find is you end up with 2 components or more capturing each one of the underlying clusters in your data. So sometimes you might have to aggregate together the individual Gaussian components in order to discover the actual true clusters which are in your data, and it may not be obvious how to do that aggregation. So in order to remedy that, more complex cluster models have been developed. So it's perfectly possible to take the Gaussian out and replace it with a more flexible sort of basic description of each one of your individual clusters that can maybe have more complicated shapes. Another limitation is that coordinate ascent is often very slow to converge. So in general, you will know from what you have experienced in optimization is if you have some optimization landscape, some function that you're trying to find the optimum of, and the contours of that function look like this, so sort of strong correlations between the 2 parameters that you're trying to optimize over. If you do coordinate-wise optimization in this case, you take baby steps at each iteration of the algorithm. It takes a very long time to wander to the optimum. So in general, direct optimization is to be preferred because that can often hop straight to the optimum in 1 step. So in practice, that means you shouldn't use EM in many cases, even though there are a huge number of implementations out there that you do. In fact, joint optimization of the free energy is possible and used a lot, and direct optimization of the likelihood, which is something we also talked about in lectures, works well too in many cases. And I wanted to end by flagging up some of the research frontiers, and there's this great paper by Dave Duverneau and colleagues from 2013, and in it they look to remedy some of the problems that we've just been identifying with the mixture Gaussians clustering model. And here what they're doing is they're doing a mixture of sort of what we call mixture of Gaussians clustering with some warping in order to describe non-Gaussian shapes. So they take a mixture Gaussians model in a latent space here. So this is the model we've been looking at before, and they pass it through a non-linear function to get to our observed space X that we've been treating before. And what this warping function allows you to do is capture sort of non-linear, like spiral structure in this example. And you can see in each one of these cases that the warping function is learned, and it's learning to cope with sort of non-Gaussian shaped clusters. This method is also directly inferring the number of clusters that are present in each example. So it's doing an inference for k given the data set that's observed. So it's actually using Bayesian inference to do an inference for what the optimal number of clusters is. And in that way, it's solving one of the other limitations of the clustering algorithms, which is that often you have to commit to a particular setting of k. In this case, it's actually being inferred directly from data. So not only can this do non-Gaussian clusters, it can also determine the number of clusters using sort of a coherent probabilistic inference approach. So I thought I'd show this to you as sort of an indication of where you can take these methods if you really work on them.